Okay, Chris, I want to play you some clips from a previous podcast episode. It's from over a year ago.
Okay, I am donning my headphones.
I can safely say that 2022, for a number of reasons, will be characterized in history as the first time that we have a very effective non-surgical treatment for this real medical condition. People will not blink at the idea that someone is managing their weight with the help of one of the modern medications that we have now for supporting obesity.
That was Dr. David Macklin. He's Medcan's Director of Weight Management. And that was from episode 115 of Eat Move Think called Is Semaglutide Right for Me? That episode ran on April 25th, 2022.
It is so funny. I can remember being in the recording session, hearing Dr. David Macklin make these bold predictions about semaglutide, which at that point, very few people had ever heard of. And then we fast forward to today, and it's everywhere under brand names like Rybelsus or Ozempic or Wegovy. And it turns out
he was right.
His bold predictions have come true. I'm Chris Shulgin.
I'm Jasmine Ratch. We're the producers of Eat Move Think.
And in this episode, we have Medcan's Director of Weight Management, Dr. David Macklin, back to talk about semaglutide.
So today, Dr. David Macklin will be talking to Chief Medical Officer Dr. Peter Nord about everything you need to know about semaglutide today.
And also, Medcan has a weight management program that helps people and uses semaglutide as an option if it's right for them. And he'll talk about that and demonstrate a little bit about how it's different from other programs. People have talked about weight loss drugs for decades. Now, finally, we have one, and that is medically approved, and we're getting guidance on that new reality from Dr. David Macklin and Dr. Peter Nord today.
Let's hand it off to the two of them.
Yeah, without further ado, here's Medical Director Dr. Peter Nord and Director of Weight Management, Dr. David Macklin, in conversation.
Well, welcome back to Eat, Move, Think, David. It's great to have you back to discuss semaglutide, the medication that everyone's certainly been talking about as the game-changing weight loss drug. Crazy interest in this medication is seen now right across Canada. In terms of prescriptions, it looks like last year in 2022, there was $808 million that went to Ozempic. Maybe we can start. You can talk a little bit about the culture around the treatment and management of obesity, and has it shifted in the past year? And how much of this has been due to semaglutide? And I guess part of that is, do you think this shift is triggering people to think about obesity as a treatable chronic condition, which I know is something that you're very passionate about?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me back to the podcast. The concept of the culture of obesity, I think, starts with a discussion that I have regularly with every new patient that I meet. And really anyone I'm discussing obesity with. A little bit of background. I'm a family physician. I have for now just about 20 years worked exclusively in the field of obesity medicine. I've been the medical director of a number of national Canadian weight management programs that focus on both behavioral therapy and medical therapy. I am a co-author of our national guidelines in 2020. Many don't know this. Canada, in a way, leads the world in obesity recognition and management, an organization called Obesity Canada, also going back about 22 years. And our guidelines are now globally recognized. The Canadian Clinical Practice Guidelines for the treatment of obesity are globally recognized, in fact, adopted and adapted by a number of countries, where the experts who came together and organized the clinical practice guidelines. It took us about 3 years. And I was very proud to be a co-author of the behavioral chapter. The culture of obesity starts in all of our discussions by inviting individuals to consider that obesity is a real medical condition. Many are surprised to learn that about 70% of someone's risk of struggling with weight in their lifetime is conferred genetically. We used to talk about 120 or maybe 300 genes that get inherited. We think of this as what's called a polygenic condition. So there are rare monogenic single gene mutations that lead to obesity. It's very rare. The absolute great majority of those who struggle with weight are struggling with a polygenic, many genes. And we're now thinking from genome-wide association studies being done that maybe the number we're going to land on is around 9,000 different genes, 9,000 from mom, 9,000 from dad. Then they collide and they create what is a unique appetite system And the human brain, it is not hyperbole to suggest its main function is calorie acquisition and defending against fat loss so that we can survive to pass on our genes. So this is not a side project of the human brain. Maybe best described as the main function of the human brain is calorie acquisition. We all inherit a unique appetite system. It has 3 layers, an executive system that you and I have access to at the front, very human, but then 2 layers that are below consciousness called the reward or hedonic system, and the other one called the homeostatic system, where a majority of our weight is regulated in parts of the brain we don't even have access to. If that doesn't sound unfair, I don't know what does. And the combination of these 3 layers regulates our weight. This is where metabolism is regulated. This is where appetite, where our brain's response to fat loss. The brain is expert at recognizing fat loss and fighting against it with increased appetite. And all of this combines, it's a progressive condition, it's strongly environmentally influenced, combines to invite individuals who struggle with weight to consider that, what if you're struggling with a real condition that's genetically conferred and brain-centered and therefore not your fault, not a flaw in character, not a lack of willpower. And diet and exercise are not considered treatment for obesity. We have 3 pillars to obesity treatment. We have behavioral therapy. This is straight out of the Canadian guidelines. Behavioral therapy, medical therapy, and surgical therapy. The Medcan clinic, the clinic that I work at, specializes in the first 2 pillars, behavioral therapy and medical therapy. And yes, to in a very roundabout way answer your question, there's been the most significant advancements in the understanding of obesity as a real medical condition because of the advancements in the second pillar, which is the medical therapy. And it's very safe to say that we are now at a stage where for the first time we have a real next level, we call them 3rd generation anti-obesity medications. There's currently 1 in Canada and soon to be 2. We call these advanced or next generation medications because of their efficacy. Because for the first time, we're seeing percentages of weight loss on average in people at 1 year and even after 1 year that are kind of unprecedented. And so that has, I believe, changed the culture of our understanding of obesity because now we consider it something that's treatable. And so it's really changed our approach and how we can best manage individuals who struggle with this real medical condition.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we'll zoom in just a little bit on those first 2 pillars then. So best if those 2 pillars are synergistic, or do you treat them as independent, or increasingly now that we have, more effective treatments under the medical arm, working together, I would imagine is the best of all?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because we're going to meet a lot of people who say, well, there's a medication that's effective, so I just want to do that. What's this behavioral part, and do I really need it? And so in all the clinical trials of anti-obesity medications, we've always talked about how the medication was an adjunct, an addition to kind of diet and exercise advice or light behavioral therapy. And it is true, we're now considering a somersault, where we'll consider that because there are effective medications, that really behavioral therapy, which is much more than just diet and exercise advice, that behavioral therapy can serve as an adjunct to these very effective medications. There's a very strong argument to make that the efficacy of the medications, the adherence by patients to medications, the advancements in tolerability to the medication, and then ultimately the outcomes, both in quality of life and health and weight, that these will all be improved by combining medical use, anti-obesity medication use, with ethical, evidence-based, and comprehensive behavioral therapy. Now, not everyone is going to be able to receive comprehensive advanced behavioral therapy like at the Medcan clinic and a few other places in Canada. But just personally, so you know, yes, I see patients 5 days a week, but another significant part of my work is both nationally and internationally training physicians so that they can implement key behavioral principles. So as prescriptions advance in anti-obesity medications, that physicians become competent and confident in their ability to provide key behavioral intervention elements. By the way, there's only 4 key behavioral elements that I would suggest that are quite critical for any doctor who's prescribing a medication. I think the listeners would find this interesting, right? So what will ultimately result in best outcomes and best adherence to anti-obesity medications going forward? Let's say there's only 4 things. If an individual understands, so this is number 1, that their struggle with weight is a real condition, that's not their fault, versus them thinking that they're taking medication because they're really a failure And this medication is a last resort. And they really shouldn't be needing to take a medication. And the fact that they are means that they're just not strong enough and too weak and with not enough motivation to do it on their own. If they believe the latter and don't understand the former, that their struggle is valid and real and not their fault and that they've just never been treated, that's already a big predictor between success and not success in long term. Secondly, what people will not understand is this key second point. Here is the logic of anti-obesity medications. And my great colleague and friend Arya Sharma describes this very well. If the brain did not defend against fat loss by increasing appetite, then there would absolutely be no need for anti-obesity medications on the planet. The only reason anti-obesity medications exist on the planet is because, and this is always, I feel like, the bearer of bad news, the brain is expert at recognizing fat loss and fighting against it. End of story. And how it does that is through increasing appetite, the drive and motivation to calories, and decreasing metabolic rate, but much more the first, increased appetite and increased desire. Anyone who's tried to lose weight will know that for the first number of weeks as they're losing weight, things aren't too tough. But then later on, they're not quite full after a meal. They find their old patterns coming back. Now, they might point towards themselves and say, this is my fault. I'm losing my motivation. That's actually not what's happening. What's happening is their brain is fighting back with more appetite, and it's becoming more difficult to self-regulate in this world where we're surrounded by everything that we're surrounded by. And things become more difficult. And that's why when people lose weight, it slows and slows and pulls in somewhere. All weight loss slows and slows and slows and pulls in somewhere. And the reason why is because the brain fights back by recognizing fat loss and increasing appetite in response to that fat loss. If our ancestors lost weight, it wasn't because of bathing suit season or to look good for pictures in a wedding. It was because primarily illness, but also interrupted food supplies. And so this second point, if individuals don't understand that weight loss will slow and pull in somewhere naturally in all people, they'll think at the bottom part of the curve that, oh, it's not working anymore. The medication stopped working, so they'll stop using the medication. And that would be another reason for poor compliance, poor adherence to the medication, let's say, and worse outcomes. Another key part people won't understand is actually what the medications are doing. They're managing appetite. They're not weight loss medications. That's a misnomer to call these weight loss medications. What the medications do is they dampen the main drive towards calories in the deep subconscious recesses of our brain that becomes conditioned in through a lifetime. And if people don't understand the actual symptom that the medications are treating, then they won't have an understanding of how the medication's helping them. Again, less likely to have good outcomes and less likely to adhere to the medication long term. And then finally, and this is quite a critical behavioral element, is how does an individual respond to setbacks? Setbacks are a normal part of any weight management process. And so it's really this interesting concept, and it's a psychology concept that anyone who struggled with weight, any behavior, will understand that eventually after many failures, any setbacks will generate an old library of thoughts of, here I go again. This is just like all the other times. It's never going to work. I'm no good at this. And those thoughts, which are automatic, lead to negative emotions and ultimately potentially demotivation and even resignation. Again, poor outcome and poor adherence to the medication. So if we focus on these four things, making individuals, helping them, inviting them to consider that their struggle is valid and it's a real condition, understanding expectations and how weight loss always slows and pulls in somewhere, understanding the main symptom that the anti-obesity medication is treating, which is wanting and the drive and the motivation to calories, and understanding that setbacks will happen and learning new ways to respond to setbacks. If we add those four components, the hypothesis is that will get the best outcomes. So they'll be best combined.
So yeah, sum is greater than the parts for sure.
Yeah, exactly right. 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a little bit about how the medication semaglutide is actually working. Maybe you can go a little bit deeper, a little bit of a crash course in a bit more detail about how it actually works, the detail.
Yeah, so the main function is to defend against the brain's response to fat loss, which is increased appetite. The concept is there's this hormone that you and I make, Peter. And when we eat, it gets released from our gut. It's called GLP-1. It's a fullness hormone or a satiety hormone. It's about one of half a dozen fullness hormones that gets released when we eat. And amongst other things, it travels to the brain. And there it creates a signal of, I'm good. I don't want any more. I'm not interested. And the reason I'm mentioning GLP-1 is because semaglutide is simply a replication of this natural hormone. Many people don't realize that. They think of it as a medication. It's actually much more a hormone. It's really 94% identical to the hormone that we make ourselves. And the 6% difference, interestingly enough, is just so that it can be a once weekly treatment. Our GLP-1, yours and mine, get broken down every 2 minutes. You can't give someone a medication every 2 minutes. And so other than that 6% difference so that it can be a once weekly treatment, it's really just a natural hormone. And the science of GLP-1 has been around for about 20 years. We have great safety studies and clinical efficacy studies. There's 3 diabetes medications, another anti-obesity medication on the market in Canada that's GLP-1. So we have a real kind of compendium of safety studies around this class of medications. And that's the role that it plays.
And then some of the questions that I and you will certainly get, but because I even get it, is, how long does it take to work? And what's a realistic timeline for someone starting the drug for the first time? And what's the typical start? And what can people expect? How quick? And ultimately, what percentage of body weight are we looking at?
Sure. So when people start the medication, even though they might target with semaglutide 2 or even 2.4 milligrams once a week eventually, they'll start at a very low dose of 0.25 milligrams and do that for a few weeks, and then 0.5 milligrams for a few weeks. Really, in our clinic, we invite patients to be the owner of the dose escalation and to go actually up as slowly as they like. There's actually such significant diversity in the response to the medication at an appetite level that actually everyone's so different that why would I be deciding whether someone needs to stay at that dose or to go up? We actually leave ownership of the dose escalation in many ways to the patients, obviously in combination with discussions with their registered dietitian and their specialized obesity physician. And when someone will start noticing effects from this medication, remember the concept is the symptom that we're treating. If we treat asthma, we're treating the symptoms of wheezing, coughing, and shortness of breath. If we treat osteoarthritis, we're treating joint swelling and disability and pain. So if we're treating obesity, what are we treating? What are we treating with this medication? And the answer is we're treating the primary subconscious drive, either wanting, desire, urge, craving, incentive, motivation, surges of dopamine in the midbrain, in the mesolimbic system. These are all the same things, which is the primary motivation and drive towards calories that is built into us and actually all of the species that are below us for the calorie imperative of survival. This is the central role of the human brain. And what do these medications do? They dampen that. Through this natural mechanism. In fact, it's quite interesting. We're always trying to help people counter internalized weight bias, the internalized belief that they have that their struggle with weight is their fault, and because of a flaw in character or a lack of willpower and them not trying hard enough, which is
self-blame. Yeah,
self-blame, which is untrue and which I've mentioned a few times already. And it turns out that in my experience, the strongest method of countering internalized weight bias is the experience that patients have within a day or two of starting the medication, where they're like, huh? Are you telling me people walk around the world like this, where halfway through a meal or 3/4 of a way through a meal, they're just satisfied and not interested and kind of done and full? And the times formerly of high risk where patients would describe there would always be food noise and I'd be thinking about my next meal and I'd be passing somewhere and it would steal my attention, or I'd be in a high risk time like sitting on the couch watching TV in the evening and my attention would be drawn towards food. You're saying there's people who have none of that and their minds are like this? So that experience that someone will have of a dampened wanting is actually a really nice method of countering internalized weight bias, because they're like, oh, I see this is a real condition and it's centered in my brain. I took a little bit of this natural hormone and now there's like an even playing field. Like I can actually have a little bit of food and stop and feel quite satisfied, like those thin people that I always wanted to strangle, right? So it's a really nice shift along a spectrum of what's called motivation and drive towards food. Wanting is the most common name for that symptom, and that's the symptom that the medication addresses. As far as outcomes, the clinical efficacy, so outcomes are varied. In the clinical trials, the primary outcome is always what percentage of weight are the people losing on average, right? And then a secondary outcome in all of the clinical trials is, what's happening to their cardiovascular risk factors? What's happening to cholesterol? What's happening to blood pressure? What's happening to other conditions like sleep apnea or a fatty liver? And so from clinical outcomes, first, percentage body weight loss, That was kind of one of the key developments around Ozempic as this next generation medication. The trade name is Ozempic, the medication is called semaglutide. One of the key developments, why it's called a next generation medication, is just because of that, the efficacy. We see at 1 year somewhere around an average of 16 or so % total body weight loss. That proves to be quite sustainable. And that's about double what we used to have as far as anti-obesity medications. So more effective. And when people lose more weight, we see even further advancements in improvements in cardiovascular risk factors and other what we call comorbid conditions. So things like osteoarthritis or sleep apnea or fatty liver or high cholesterol or high blood pressure or diabetes, we see improvements in all of those. And the more weight that someone loses, the more significant the improvements in health. And then there's this other fuzzy outcome called quality of life, which we don't measure very well in the clinical trials, but I can tell you I certainly see in about 16 out of 16 patients that I might see in a day if they're also taking medication. And within our behavioral program, the quality of life outcomes are food's less on my mind. I'm much more mobile. I have more energy. I'm sleeping better. I feel better. I feel better and more confident about how I look. But most importantly, people will say, I'm least limited from doing all the things I actually want to do in my life. Right? I want to be this active, engaged grandparent who is able to travel and spend time with my kids and my grandkids and climb the stairs up to the beautiful view from the monastery, from the country that we travel to. And I'm finding now I'm least limited from doing all these things that I want to do. Now, that's not measured in the anti-obesity clinical trials, but that ends up being actually the most important outcomes for individuals.
Yeah. Well, there's the positives. Are there any negatives? What are the risks? Or there's a lot of social media comments around some of the risks, some of the stuff that may or may not be true. So maybe go through either risks and side effects.
Yeah, adverse events or side effects would be two categories, really important. And actually, I realize I haven't mentioned this yet, and I do want to have this added to the record. I always like to include disclosures in any conversations I'm having about anti-obesity medications. The manufacturer of semaglutide, trade name Ozempic, the manufacturer's name is Novo Nordisk. They're a company in Denmark, a pharmaceutical company, and I receive honoraria, consulting fees, licensing fees. I'm a member of their national advisory board, the Canadian National Advisory Board for Obesity. I certainly travel both nationally and internationally, training physicians and other healthcare practitioners, discussing obesity globally. And so that's always something to consider when you're listening to me talking about this specific medication, because the manufacturer and I have that relationship and have for approximately 10 years. Good. I have that disclosure. And so, especially important when you start talking about safety. What's very interesting about the safety of this medication is we actually see shortages of this medication because of, and this is kind of from really interesting and very smart experts in this field, we kind of put our heads together and we're finding that it's a little bit of a unicorn in this way. It's very rare that a significant disease state and our ability to treat that disease state with a new medication, it's very rare that that new class of medications is remarkably safe and doesn't have significant adverse effects. And I think it's resulted in kind of a little bit of an irresponsible or lackadaisical prescription pattern amongst physicians in Canada and the United States, where the physician knows, well, at least we know there's really no significant adverse effects. So at worst, these people are going to have side effects. So sure, I'll write the prescription. So what ends up being good news for patients in that we have a primarily safe and significantly safe class of medications carries also that problem. So starting with adverse events, we have 20 years of science around GLP-1 medications. I would say with great confidence that there are no cancer risks associated with the medication. The reason I mention this is 20 years ago, there was discussions around a very rare thyroid cancer called medullary thyroid cancer in mice. Bad news for mice, but not for humans, because 20 years later, there's really been no signal, any appreciable signal of an increase in any cancers. In fact, we know if someone loses 15% or more of their body weight, and we know this from the gastric bypass surgery data, that there is a significant reduction in cancer risk when someone loses excess adiposity. Adiposity is the word we use, the fancy word we use for fat. We consider excess adiposity to be the leading preventable cause of cancer in Canada. Right? Smoking and excess adiposity neck and neck. But I think when you look at the numbers, excess adiposity is leading.
Hmm.
Next, we talk about heart disease and stroke whenever we talk about the risks of medication. Interestingly enough, if anything, we think that this class of medications reduces the risk of heart disease and stroke. It's a suggested outcome with this medication. It's more than suggested. It's quite tested and evident in people who are living with diabetes. This is really interesting, Peter. I don't know if this gets mentioned enough, but this class of medications has been shown in a clinical trial called first the LEADER trial, and then a next trial using semaglutide specifically that showed that in people living with diabetes, being on this class of medications reduces major adverse cardiac outcomes. So less heart attacks, less strokes, and less death, the stuff that we're really, really worried about. Less happens. And it seems that the effect is independent of weight loss and independent of it helping with their blood sugar, some anti-inflammatory effect of this class of medications. The jury's out exactly to figure out why this happens. In fact, we're going to find out probably within the next 6 months whether that's the case also in people who are at increased risk of heart disease who don't have diabetes. Another kind of concept around adverse effects, specifically important because anti-obesity medications in the past, some have been taken off the market specifically because of cardiovascular adverse events. So to think that we have now a medication that in fact does the opposite is quite a promising prospect. Right? We used to talk about 1 in 1,000 having a risk of inflammation of the pancreas, what you would know as acute pancreatitis. I really don't know where to land on this because when we look at all the semaglutide data now, we actually see that there is a higher rate of acute pancreatitis in these clinical trials in the placebo arm versus the treatment arm. People in placebo get more acute pancreatitis. So is it really a signal? I actually don't know, but certainly it's very important to monitor patients for any symptoms that are suggestive of acute pancreatitis and to follow up pretty aggressively if anything like that is noted.
Any other GI symptoms at all?
So side effects now, about 80% of people will have side effects with this class of medications. And side effects are primarily part of just the dose escalation, the early stages of the use of the medication, very rare past that. Mild to moderate symptoms, the most common being mild nausea and mild heartburn, also possible mild diarrhea, mild constipation, also mild fatigue and mild headache. And this is another piece of the puzzle. We find that a very advanced behavioral program like ours at Medcan, we're really able to stay close to patients. And if they are experiencing any of these mild side effects early on, there's a lot of things you can think about and support them with. And by getting through that period, because side effects are very famous with this class of medication by being part of the early stages and not the late stages of the medication. Very rare that long-term, only about 5% of people will describe later than the dose escalation period, continued nausea. It's about 5% of the population in the clinical trials. That fits about with my clinical experience as well. So generally safe, well-tolerated medication, significantly effective medication for a real condition that people have not been treated for before. So it's a really fun and exciting time. I always tell physicians everywhere and anywhere, anyone who will listen, that the field of obesity medicine, I say, is certainly the most exciting field of medicine right now of any. And that's echoed by a lot of experts in endocrinology, a lot of experts in obesity medicine, and even in primary care, where it's enough with kind of putting Band-Aids on conditions. Why not get to the root of it? Obesity is the leading preventable cause of death and disability on the planet. End of story. And healthcare systems are being dragged down because of the incidence and prevalence of obesity. And here we are now. This should be the headline of all kind of these stories about Ozempic. Here we are at the precipice of being able to finally treat this condition respectfully and ethically, and be able to support individuals struggling with this real disease effectively. And I foresee a time in the near future. Remember, I was making predictions, I guess, a year ago. I'll make another prediction that starting within about 5 years, we're going to see healthcare systems globally being saved by this class of medications because of reduced costs and increased health amongst those who have been otherwise struggling with this real medical condition untreated.
Amazing. And maybe to the question that I often get asked, and it's sort of probably the third question that, when people are starting to talk about this drug is, if I stop taking the drug, what happens? Is there anything new that we've learned, especially around this concept of, if I stop, I just put all the weight back on again?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Chronic diseases in medicine, as you know, Peter, are treated chronically. So what's very interesting, and we rarely hear, you're on Synthroid? Oh my God, how long are you going to stay on Synthroid? And what's going to happen? Is your thyroid level going to go down when you stop your Synthroid? You're on asthma medications? Oh my God, what's going to happen when you stop taking? Certainly you're going to start wheezing and coughing again. And then add to the uniqueness of obesity is that the brain defends against fat loss. So yes, we consider when the prescription of an anti-obesity medication is written, it is written with the logic that this is a long-term treatment for a long-term and chronic condition. We have no evidence that the brain will ever give up trying to get someone back up to their highest weight, which it has bookmarked, and get them back up there with increased appetite. These GLP-1 medications and the ones that will be coming down the pipe are actually very easy to stop. You just stop taking it. There's no even de-escalation necessary. You stop taking the medication, and then the effect of the medication on dampening your brain's response to get you back up ends. It washes out in about, because it's a little bit of a slower medication, it washes out in really classically 8 weeks. It'll be completely washed out. And then your appetite goes back to whatever it would be. If you're a 270-pound guy and now the medication has helped you get to 210 pounds and you come off of the medication, you're going to learn something. What and how strong is my appetite system when I'm bookmarked at 270 as a set point, and now I'm at 210? That's what you're going to learn when you come off the medication. I kind of talk about that with patients as a street fight. Their attention, their desire, they're on their mind is food. They're not satisfied and they want more. And a lot of self-regulation skills are called for, and it's very difficult. And food is on their mind, and all of their mental bandwidth is required for this one thing, to stay down at this lower weight at the cost of maybe their work and their family, right? Or you stay on a very effective and safe medication long-term that kind of defends you against your brain's efforts to get you back up. We leave it up to patients. You know, in modern medicine, we never tell patients what to do, right? I know you practice that way as well. So we invite patients to consider, if they want, they can find out what life is like without the medication. What's interesting, though, is that there's no down regulation of receptors. There's no change that happens in their appetite system that's irrevocable because of them being on the medication. In case someone's wondering that, that's not the case.
So maybe one of the reasons that they would want to stop is cost. So, right now, not really covered by a lot of insurance companies. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about, what is the cost? And in the near term, do we think it's going to get covered? You would think it would be because of the downstream benefits to the health systems globally. But currently, we're not there yet. So what is the cost?
So an average middle level dose of semaglutide as an anti-obesity medication would cost someone somewhere around $230 to $240 each month. That would be the cost. About 20 to 30%. We used to say 15 to 25. We're seeing a shift. 20 to 30% or more of group benefit plans are supporting patients by paying for the medication. In Ontario, the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan will pay for a significant portion of Ozempic for people above the age of 65. But really, in theory, that's for those living with diabetes. And the cost of the medication will eventually become less for a number of reasons. First of all, this is a diabetes medication. So to be very clear, semaglutide, the trade name Ozempic is on the market in Canada as a medication for type 2 diabetes. There is a version of semaglutide that is on the market in America, not in Canada, for anti-obesity, and it's called Wegovy. It's the identical medication. Why is it not here in Canada, despite Health Canada approving Wegovy, which is a 2.4 milligram dose of semaglutide? Because of undersupply and overdemand in America. It was supposed to be a year ago. Health Canada approved Wegovy a year ago, and it's not here. And we really don't know when it'll get here because the demand is so high and the supply is so low that what was really meant to be launched in the example of Wegovy globally at this point is only in America, Denmark, and I think Sweden. It's really gone nowhere else because they actually can't keep up with the demand. So it's a really interesting time. So you can imagine once more medications come onto the market, then there's competition, and then there's more of an understanding of the effectiveness of the medication. And so we're at the very beginnings. And so it's the most painful point for patients. And it's a really unfortunate case. Imagine a humanistic physician who's able to treat obesity so effectively and knowing that the single most effective medication that's available for them is unaffordable and it's not paid for by their group benefit plan, yet the medication is Health Canada approved. So those market forces will change eventually and it'll become less and less expensive. And there's quite an exciting list of medications that are coming, and there'll be more. Again, another prediction. in 5 years, there will be 4 or 5 or more remarkably effective and safe anti-obesity medications.
Well, I guess the only other thing, obviously some amazing benefits to the medication. Some people might be needle phobic, and it is an injection, and it's a once a week injection. In the States, they're having a pill version that has been approved. Is that coming to Canada anytime soon?
Sure. So this is actually, for some people, a confusing concept. I'll go through it step by step. So semaglutide has actually 3 forms. The injectable forms that are both the diabetes, trade name Ozempic, and anti-obesity, trade name Wegovy. But there's a third version of semaglutide on the market in Canada and the United States, which is called Rybelsus. That's the trade name. And Rybelsus is, in fact, semaglutide. It's the same medication, and it's in a pill form. And the maximum dose is what's called 14 milligrams. And the medication is an effective diabetes medication, but the dose that they can reach now with the oral form is low enough that it's considered only about 1/5 of the dose that the injectable medication Wegovy can reach. So because it's only 1/5 of the medication dose, it's really not being used as an anti-obesity medication, but it's on the market here in Canada. Interestingly enough, published in The Lancet very recently, presented by my brilliant colleague Sue Pedersen at the American Diabetes Association conference, the OASIS-1 clinical trial, where there's a now 50 milligram form of Rybelsus, which is a much higher dose, and which showed in an anti-obesity trial to be as effective as the top dose of Wegovy. So 15 or so % mean weight loss at 1 year versus about 2 in the placebo group. So that's going to be really interesting when there's an oral dose. Now, what are patients going to prefer? I actually don't know. If the pill is something you have to take every day, and you can't take it kind of within 30 minutes of other food or other medications versus a once weekly, very simple subcutaneous injection, which every patient I've ever kind of prescribed this to says is the easiest thing that they could ever do. And then when we look down the line, this medication, Rybelsus, is a peptide form. What that means is it's still the shape of this protein. There are non-peptide versions of GLP-1 receptor agonists that are coming soon. And we're seeing phase 2 and into phase 3 trials where these medications are actually more bioavailable and they're actually easier to take in a way in that you don't have to kind of have it with water or without water or with food or without food. And so when those come onto the market, and the shelf life will be what it is for a tablet, we'll see really interesting price reductions is my prediction. I don't know for sure. Price reductions as the non-peptide GLP-1 medications, the non-protein ones that are more easily, let's say, or effectively absorbed. So that's going to come too, and that's going to be soon. And again, that'll drive down prices, and the effectiveness is showing to be the same as what we're seeing with other injectable GLP-1 medications. Pretty cool.
Great predictions for the future. Really an optimistic future for sure that you've laid out there. You know, you also mentioned cardiovascular benefits. There's been some studies that have come out specifically about the benefit early studies looking at the benefit on dementia. Maybe you could just mention any recent studies that have come out in that area.
Yeah, so the early excitement in animal models of GLP-1 medications in outcomes that might suggest reduced progress of dementia have been kind of mixed in the human clinical trials. The idea has been that there are vascular causes of dementia. And if vessels like heart disease is caused by narrowing vessels, if you have a treatment that helps other vessels, the vessels that feed the brain, become less narrow or more slowly narrow, vascular dementia is when the vessels narrow enough that parts of the brain start to die off. And so there are clinical trials right now that are being done with semaglutide in humans, specifically looking at the effect of vascular dementia and can the progress of dementia be slowed by early treatment of these medications. That is still a let's wait and see. But you bring up a really good point, which is now we're thinking less about outcomes. If there's a real difference in our discussions around anti-obesity medications over the last year, it's the following. We're talking a lot less about how much weight loss people will have, what percentage of weight loss they'll have. And instead, there's a focus on, do these meds improve diseases that are associated with obesity, right? People with osteoarthritis or fatty liver or sleep apnea or high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease. We're looking for disease states, and specifically so we can start focusing on the treatment of obesity because of the benefits for how it will reduce not only the burden of obesity, but what we call the metabolic complications or physical complications of obesity, which is really a list of about 230 conditions that are affected by obesity or made worse by obesity, triggered by obesity. But the main ones people know: high cholesterol, diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, fatty liver, osteoarthritis, esophageal reflux, a condition called PCOS. That's kind of, let's call that a short list. And so people with any of those conditions could anticipate that anti-obesity medications, if they also struggle with weight, can dramatically improve their profile with those conditions as well.
Maybe that's a good segue to another question that I've been asked a couple of times. You probably, again, get these more often. Can I take this medication if I'm normal weight and I want to drop weight? Maybe I'm an athlete. Maybe I want to, use it for that. What happens in people that are more normal weight, so non-obese patients that would come to you and say, I'd like to try this?
Short answer is it's not studied. In the monograph of these medications this medication is appropriate because it's been studied for safety and efficacy in this population. What's the population? For anti-obesity medications currently, it's people with a body mass index, which is really just a measure of kilograms over meters squared. So it's just a measurement of their height and their weight. And we don't use BMI actually in our field of medicine, except for it's still a vestige. It still sticks in the regulations of medication. So the applicability and appropriateness of this medication would be for a person who has a BMI, a body mass index above 30, or a body mass index above 27 with what we call comorbidities like high blood pressure, diabetes, or high cholesterol. So that's the population that the medications have been studied in. So we really don't know. I mean, is it possible that there will be more prescriptions? Certainly. Not clinical trial outcomes, but real world trial outcomes. Real world data will start presenting, because it's my guess that a significant portion of the medications that are being prescribed, some percentage, I don't know if it's 10 or 15, are being prescribed to people that by the monograph would not be appropriate for this medication. So we're going to have all this real world data because people will be using the medication. Generally, people want to be thinner and lose weight in a sustainable way. So we really anticipate, again, because of the safety, because of the tolerability of this class of medications, that more than just those who are appropriate via the monograph, that others will be going on the medication. So what's going to happen, that's kind of what happens in science, is we start to get real world data, not clinical trial data, and we start to actually collect that and see. So stay tuned. Certainly something that's happening now. But as far as the safety and the efficacy, we don't really know.
Well, you've given us some predictions in the past that came true, David. And what do you think is coming down the pike now? What are the exciting things that are just over the horizon?
It's actually, as I've mentioned earlier, this is a very exciting time in the field of obesity medicine and anti-obesity medications. Though we have currently this first medication that we described, semaglutide, and there is a next medication that will be hopefully coming soon to Canada. The concepts of the growth of the field of anti-obesity medications is actually one of the most exciting concepts today, currently in medicine. Principle number one, we're seeing numbers in the next medications that are regular and very high double-digit weight loss. So we're seeing higher levels of efficacy in what's coming down the pike. Second, we're seeing significant improvements in not just weight, but what are the comorbidities, improvements in disease. A next medication, semaglutide, is this replication of the GLP-1 hormone. There's another appetite hormone called GIP, which is also shown to reduce appetite. And the next medication, which is trade name Mounjaro, is what is called a dual agonist. So it's not only agonizing or hitting the receptors for GLP-1, it's also hitting the receptors for GIP. And the outcomes show to some significant percentage higher weight loss, higher by mean percentage of weight loss than even semaglutide. You get the feel this is where the field is going. They're kind of replicating each of these natural appetite hormones that themselves naturally that we produce create satiety that some people have more of and some people have less of. And then this concept of combining medications. So why not put them all together? A next hormone is called glucagon. And glucagon works by reducing appetite and, interestingly, increasing energy expenditure. So everything we've talked about is about decreasing calories in. But there's now part of the field that's looking at supporting actually increased energy expenditure or reducing the drop in metabolism that happens as people lose weight otherwise. And glucagon is thought to do this, reduce appetite and increase energy. So now a combination of GLP-1 and glucagon, a dual agonist of those two, is in kind of later stages and showing very promising results. And then why not put them all together? What about a medication that's a triple agonist, GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon? And that's also in advanced stages of study, showing, again, numbers, maybe even the most significant numbers that are really nearing gastric bypass surgery outcomes. And so it brings up this interesting question of, whatever the maximum dose of these medications, a lot of people in theory won't need to be ever on the maximum dose. How do we treat blood pressure? We don't put people right away on the maximum dose. We say, does this dose get them to target? So there'll be this principle in obesity of treating to target. Are we getting to that stage now where we'll allow patients to kind of find the dose that works for them, and they might not be at the maximum dose. They might get to target their best weight, where their comorbidities are best managed, and they're most healthy and their quality of life is most, without even reaching the maximum dose. That's all on the horizon. And so, stay tuned. And when you consider again that this is the leading preventable cause of death and disability on the planet, and the general population in the world is untreated, because diet and exercise are not treatment, behavioral therapy and medical therapy are treatment, that we're going to see a real shift in the incidence and prevalence of obesity over the coming 5 and 10 years.
Really interesting.
Very exciting.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect answer, and probably a good place to stop. We've gone through a lot of questions. You've given us a lot to think about. Fantastic answers. I know everyone's going to be super interested. And factoid, out of 180 episodes of Eat, Move, Think, the April 2022 episode was actually the most popular on YouTube.
Oh, the one where we were discussing semaglutide, that became the most popular Eat, Move, Think.
Exactly. The last time we were talking. This is part 2 with a lot more information, a lot more experience, because it's, again, it's been out more in the public domain in the last year or so. So, super exciting field, as you said, in medicine. And boy, thanks for sharing your insights and your expertise, David.
You're very welcome, Peter. My real pleasure. Yeah. And thanks for inviting me.
That was Medcan's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Peter Nord, in conversation with the Director of Medcan's Weight Management Program, Dr. David Macklin.
Find Dr. David Macklin on Twitter at David Macklin MD, DAVID MACKLIN MD.
And follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube at Medcan Live Well. Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat, Move, Think is produced by Ghost Sparrow.
I'm Jasmine Ratch, managing producer.
I'm Chris Shulgin, executive producer. Social media and strategy support is from Andrew Imex, Chantal Gertin, and Emily Bozic.
We'll be back soon with another episode examining the latest in health and wellness. This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.